Stop forcing persistence. Stop repeating techniques. That urge to do more is the final echo of the old state. When creation is finished, effort disappears. Neville Goddard was precise about this, even if his words were often overlooked in favor of techniques. He taught that creation is finished the moment the imaginal act is accepted as fact, and that acceptance always expresses itself as rest. Not boredom, not indifference. Rest. Like a hand that has pressed a seed into the soil and then withdraws, not because it doubts the seed, but because growth no longer requires interference. The hand does not hover above the ground to make sure something is happening. It releases. And in that release, the unseen work begins. This is where persistence is so often misunderstood. Persistence is not repetition born from anxiety, and it is not forcing an emotion you do not feel. Persistence is remaining faithful to an inner position, without feeling the need to revisit it. It is staying where you have already arrived. When something is truly yours inwardly, you do not keep announcing it to yourself. You simply live from it. The effort fades not because you gave up, but because effort is no longer necessary. William Blake hinted at this division long before most ever spoke of manifestation. He suggested that the true separation between states is not visible to the eye, but perceptual, inward, almost imperceptible from the outside. Two people can look identical, live similar lives, and yet be occupying entirely different inner worlds. The shift does not demand evidence, it produces it later. First, it changes the way you see, the way you feel, the way you quietly relate to yourself when no one else is listening. And this is the promise you are being led toward now. There is a specific sign that appears when the inner work is finished, and it is not excitement, anticipation, or constant mental rehearsal. It is something far more subtle and far more decisive. Once you recognize it, you will understand why it only appears once and why after it does, the old self no longer has anything left to hold on to. What makes this moment so easy to overlook is precisely what makes it real. It does not arrive with heightened emotion or a sense of arrival that demands recognition. Instead, it feels almost disappointingly ordinary, as though nothing significant has happened at all. And yet, this ordinariness is not a flaw in the process. It is the signature of completion. When something is truly finished inwardly, it does not ask for validation. It simply fits. The closing of a door is rarely an event when the door aligns perfectly with its frame. There is no echo, no resistance, no sound worth noting, but that silence is not emptiness, it is precision. In the same way, the completion of an inner assumption produces no drama because there is no friction left inside you. The desire no longer pushes against doubt, and the new identity no longer argues with the old one. Everything clicks into place so naturally that the mind, conditioned to expect struggle, assumes nothing has occurred. This is why so many people keep searching for a sign they have already passed. They expect manifestation to announce itself with excitement or relief so strong it cannot be missed. But the deeper truth is that the stronger the inner alignment, the less sensation it produces. When there is no inner conflict, there is nothing to feel your way through. The nervous system quiets, the mental noise softens. Life continues, but it continues from a slightly different center. There is a subtle shift that happens here, one that cannot be forced and does not need to be defended. You stop waiting for confirmation because the need for confirmation dissolves. The mind does not rush to check outcomes or measure progress. It rests, not because it has been told to, but because there is nothing left to resolve. The desire that once felt urgent now feels settled, as if it has found its place within you. And this is the pivot most people miss. Because nothing dramatic happened, they assume nothing permanent happened. They reopen the door that had already closed. They revisit thoughts that had already quieted. They re-engage effort where effort had naturally ended. In doing so, they step out of the very stillness that signaled completion. The moment was there, silent and precise, but it required recognition, not reaction. Persistence ends the moment. Identity becomes natural. There comes a point when repetition quietly loses its purpose, not because something went wrong, but because something has finally settled. At first, the new identity feels intentional, almost deliberate, like a coat you consciously put on each day. You remember to think from it. You remember to return to it. But this stage is not the end, it is the bridge. The end arrives when remembering is no longer required. Think about your own name. You do not repeat it internally to make sure it belongs to you. You do not wake up and reaffirm it so it feels real. You respond to it without effort because recognition has replaced reinforcement. In the same way, when an assumed identity becomes natural, it no longer needs to be maintained. It maintains itself. The inner conversation that once reminded you who you are simply goes quiet, not from neglect, but from familiarity. This is the moment persistence completes its function. Persistence was never meant to be endless action. It was meant to carry you until the assumption became stable. Once stability is reached, continuing to push only creates unnecessary tension. Effort becomes redundant, like holding onto a railing long after you have already found your balance. The body knows when it can stand on its own, and the mind knows when an identity no longer needs supervision. As this naturalness settles in, something subtle but profound changes in your inner posture. You stop measuring yourself against your former state. You no longer feel the need to correct thoughts as often, because fewer corrections are required. The new identity does not feel exciting or fragile. It feels obvious, and what feels obvious is rarely questioned. This is also why the end can feel anticlimactic. There is no inner announcement declaring that persistence is over. It simply fades. The desire to repeat affirmations softens. The impulse to check your inner state weakens. What remains is a quiet continuity, a sense that you are no longer trying to be someone. You are simply being, and in that being, the work that once felt active has already reached its conclusion. One of the clearest signs that an inner shift has completed is not something you add, but something you quietly stop doing. There is a moment when the senses, which once held authority over your state, lose their influence without resistance. You do not argue with appearances. You do not fight them. You simply stop asking them for permission to feel certain. The outer world continues to present itself, but it is no longer the reference point it once was. This change is subtle because it does not feel rebellious or dramatic. It feels practical. When you step indoors, you do not continue checking the weather to decide whether you are dry. The question no longer makes sense. In the same way, when the inner assumption has settled, the senses are no longer consulted for confirmation. Not because they are denied, but because they have been outranked. At this stage, appearances may still fluctuate, but they no longer provoke the same internal response. The nervous system does not tighten at every contradiction, and the mind does not rush to interpret every detail. There is a quiet confidence that does not need to defend itself. You are no longer reacting to life in order to stabilize your state. The state has stabilized on its own. This withdrawal of attention is often mistaken for indifference, but it is nothing of the sort. It is a reordering of authority. The inner position has become primary, and the outer world has returned to its proper place as an effect, not a judge. You still see what is happening, but you no longer feel compelled to translate it into meaning about yourself. And it is here, in this unannounced shift, that something Neville referred to as Sabbath begins to emerge. Not as a technique and not as waiting, but as a natural pause that follows completion. The mind rests because it is no longer negotiating with appearances. The senses are still present, but they are no longer being consulted. And in that quiet withdrawal, a deeper certainty takes root, one that does not need constant reassurance to remain intact. This channel exists for the moment you are in right now. Subscribe, so this understanding stays with you and the old patterns never regain their voice. Sabbath is not waiting, it is completion. There is a deep misunderstanding around rest that causes many to misread the most important moment of the entire process. Rest is often confused with passivity, with giving up, or with a kind of tense pause filled with expectation. But the Sabbath spoken of in Neville's work is none of these things. It is not a decision you make, and it is not a discipline you practice. It is a condition that arrives on its own when something has genuinely concluded within you. Sabbath is not the space before manifestation. It is the evidence that manifestation inwardly is already finished. Waiting always contains tension. Even when it is quiet, it leans forward. It listens for footsteps. It scans for signs. Completion does none of this. Completion settles backward into itself. When the inner act is truly done, the mind does not hover over it, wondering when it will appear. The question no longer forms. Not because you are suppressing it, but because it no longer feels relevant. The desire has already moved from something you want into something you are resting inside. This is why Sabbath cannot be imitated. Many attempt to rest while still secretly checking whether rest is working. That state is not Sabbath. It is effort, disguised as calm. True rest has a different texture. It feels unremarkable, almost too simple. There is no sense of holding a position. The position holds you. You do not feel like you are maintaining an assumption. You feel like you are living from a settled place where maintenance is unnecessary. The analogy of the artist is precise here. While a painting is incomplete, the artist feels a pull toward it. Something calls for adjustment, refinement, correction. The eye searches for imbalance. But when the painting is done, that pull disappears. The artist does not stand in front of it, wondering whether it might suddenly become finished tomorrow. The work has closed itself. Stepping back is not an act of restraint. It is a response to finality. Any further involvement would feel intrusive rather than helpful. Sabbath carries this same internal signal. The mind no longer circles the desire. Thoughts about it may arise, but they do not hook attention. They pass through without stirring action. There is no longer a sense that something must be protected or reinforced. The assumption has stabilized at a level where it no longer needs supervision. This is why Sabbath often feels quieter than expected. There is no excitement because excitement belongs to anticipation, and anticipation belongs to something that has not yet settled. What replaces anticipation is relief, but not the dramatic relief that follows struggle or fear. This relief is subtle and grounded. It feels like the end of an inner argument you did not realize was ongoing. The body softens. The mental background noise lowers. You may not even associate this feeling with manifestation at first. It can feel like neutrality or even mild disinterest, until you recognize that what has disappeared is effort itself. This is the critical distinction. Sabbath is not disengagement from desire. It is identification with it. You are no longer reaching toward an outcome because you are no longer positioned outside of it. The desire has been absorbed into your sense of self, and when something becomes part of you, you do not wait for it. You live from it. That is why Sabbath feels like completion rather than pause. It is not the stillness before movement. It is the stillness that follows certainty. There is a specific kind of relief that appears when an inner identity has completed its transition, and it is unlike emotional highs or sudden happiness. It does not rush through you, and it does not demand expression. It settles. This relief feels almost physical, as though something that had been quietly weighing on you has finally been set down. Not because you consciously decided to release it, but because you realized you were no longer carrying it. Imagine walking for a long time with a heavy bag on your shoulder, so long that the strain became normal. You adjusted your posture around it. You compensated without thinking, and then, without ceremony, you place it on the ground. For a moment, nothing dramatic happens. You simply stand there. But then the body registers the absence of pressure, and a deep, wordless relief spreads through you. That relief is not excitement. It is recognition. The load is gone. This is how the old self finishes. It does not collapse through conflict or resistance. It dissolves through irrelevance. The habits of tension, doubt, and self-monitoring lose their function when the new identity becomes stable. The mind no longer needs to manage the desire because it no longer feels separate from it. What you once guarded closely now feels secure enough to be left alone. This relief is often mistaken for indifference, and that misunderstanding causes people to panic unnecessarily. They assume that because the emotional charge has softened, they must have lost desire or motivation, but nothing has been lost. What has disappeared is the friction between who you were and who you have become. Certainty does not feel intense. It feels calm. It does not pull attention toward itself. It allows attention to move freely again. There is also a quiet emotional release that accompanies this shift. Not a dramatic catharsis, but a gentle unwinding. The nervous system, no longer tasked with vigilance, begins to relax. Thoughts slow. Inner conversations shorten. You may find yourself less concerned with timing, explanation, or reassurance. The urgency that once fueled effort no longer has a reason to exist. This is the signal that the old self is finished. Not because you defeated it, but because you outgrew it. States do not end through force. They end through abandonment. When attention no longer feeds them, they quietly exit the stage. And the relief you feel is not the absence of desire. It is the absence of inner resistance. The work did not end because you stopped caring. It ended because caring was no longer strained. One of the most misunderstood aspects of inner change is the belief that the old self must be confronted, challenged, or overcome. This belief comes from a habit of seeing identity as something solid, something that must be dismantled through effort. But states are not structures. They are occupations. They exist only as long as they are lived in. When a state is no longer inhabited, it does not resist. It simply fades. The old self collapses quietly because it is not defeated, it is abandoned. Like a fire that burns brightly only while it is fed, a state remains active only while attention sustains it. Remove the fuel and there is no struggle. There is no final battle. There is only the natural extinguishing of something that no longer has a function. The flames do not argue for their survival. They go out. This is why inner change, when it is real, feels almost anticlimactic. People expect a dramatic internal confrontation, a moment where doubts are silenced once and for all. But what actually happens is far simpler. The thoughts that once felt convincing lose their urgency. The reactions that once felt automatic soften. You notice them less, not because you are suppressing them, but because you are no longer positioned inside the state that generated them. The old self does not cling. It does not chase you. It does not demand attention when it is no longer being referenced. What gives it the appearance of persistence is repeated occupation. When the inner narrative shifts and attention stabilizes in a new identity, the old patterns are left without reinforcement. They may echo briefly like sound in an empty room, but echoes are not voices. They have no intent behind them. This is also why trying to get rid of the old self often prolongs its presence. Resistance is still attention. Fighting a state keeps you engaged with it. But when attention naturally relocates, there is no fight to be had. The new self does not need to push the old one away. It simply remains where it is. And because attention stays there, the old state is left unoccupied. There is a quiet intelligence in this process that does not require management. You do not have to monitor whether the old self is fully gone. The very act of checking places you back in reference to it. True collapse happens when you are no longer interested in verifying collapse at all. The state ends because it no longer matters. What remains is the new self, not as a fragile position that must be defended, but as the most natural place for attention to rest. You are not holding it together. It holds itself together, and because it does, there is no internal drama, no sense of transition in progress. The collapse has already occurred. It happened the moment attention stopped feeding what you no longer were. There is a very specific inner shift that occurs once the assumption has settled, and it is marked not by action, but by the absence of a particular impulse. Before this point, attention naturally returned to the desire again and again, not out of obsession but out of incompletion. Something still felt open, something still felt in motion, but once that inner movement finishes, the mind begins to quiet in a way that feels unfamiliar to anyone who has spent a long time consciously creating. And it is precisely here that the urge to check can arise, not because the state is unstable, but because the old habit of effort has not yet fully dissolved. Checking is not a neutral activity. It always carries an assumption with it, even when it feels subtle. To check is to momentarily step outside of the state and look at it as an object, and the moment you do that, you are no longer living from it. You are relating to it. This distinction is quiet but critical. Living from an identity requires no observation. Observing it places you back in the position of someone who has not fully occupied it yet. The mind learned to check as a survival mechanism within the old self. It monitored circumstances, emotions, and outcomes to maintain a sense of control. So when inner effort ends, the mind may attempt to preserve familiarity by reintroducing monitoring under a more refined label. It can appear as awareness, mindfulness, or responsibility, but its function is the same. It pulls attention back into the old role of evaluator rather than inhabitant. This is why Neville's analogy of the seed is not symbolic, but structural. The soil represents undisturbed assumption. Once the seed is planted, the conditions that allow it to grow are not active interference, but quiet containment. Digging into the soil, even briefly, exposes the seed to light and air prematurely. It does not destroy the seed, but it interrupts the environment required for growth. Checking operates in the same way. It re-exposes the assumption to the very uncertainty that had been resolved. What makes this stage particularly deceptive is that checking often feels gentle and intelligent. It does not feel like doubt. It feels like curiosity, like staying engaged with the process. But engagement belongs to becoming, not being. When an identity is natural, engagement dissolves. You do not stay engaged with your own name, your own body, or your own existence. You live through them without inspection. The more natural a state becomes, the less observable it feels from the inside. This is also why checking tends to resurrect emotional reactions that had already faded. A single glance outward can reintroduce comparison, interpretation, and evaluation. The nervous system, sensing the return of uncertainty, begins to tighten again. The relief that marked completion becomes muted, not because it was false, but because attention briefly left the state that produced it. This is how people misinterpret checking as harmless, while experiencing its quiet consequences. The old self does not return with force. It returns through familiarity. Checking feels familiar because it was once necessary, but necessity has ended. The new self does not require confirmation to remain intact. It exists through continuity of attention, not through supervision. The moment attention rests elsewhere, even momentarily, the old patterns recognize an opening, not to attack, but to be occupied again. And yet it is important to understand that the disappearance of checking cannot be forced. Attempting to stop checking through effort only keeps attention fixed on the idea of checking. True cessation comes through irrelevance. When certainty is complete, the question dissolves on its own. There is nothing to monitor because nothing feels uncertain. The mind does not congratulate itself for not checking. It simply does not move in that direction. This is what Neville meant by faithfulness. Faithfulness is not vigilance, discipline, or restraint. It is loyalty to an inner position so complete that there is no impulse to look away from it. It is the quiet consistency of identity, not the active defense of belief. When checking stops, it is not because you are doing something right. It is because the assumption has become so natural that observation would feel unnatural. And in that absence of checking, something profound stabilizes. The state no longer fluctuates. The old self has no doorway through which to re-enter, not because it was locked out, but because attention has fully settled elsewhere. When you no longer feel the need to look, the work has already been done. There is a point at which identity no longer needs reinforcement, and yet something gently seals it into place. This is where SATS, the state akin to sleep, fulfills its true function. Not as a method for repetition, and not as a tool for persuasion, but as a condition in which the mind naturally accepts what it no longer resists. SATS does not create the assumption at this stage. It confirms it. It locks in what has already become true inwardly. The power of this state lies in its softness. As the body relaxes and the conscious mind loosens its grip, the critical faculty that once evaluated and questioned begins to withdraw. Thought slows, inner resistance fades, and what remains is a receptive awareness that no longer argues with identity. This is why SATS is not effortful when it appears at the right time. It feels almost passive, as though you are allowing something to settle rather than trying to make something happen. The analogy of warm wax is precise. Wax does not resist a stamp when it is pliable and undisturbed. It receives the impression easily without force. But once the wax cools, the impression becomes fixed. In the same way, SATS provides the ideal inner condition for identity to be impressed without friction. The state does not ask for repetition because repetition belongs to persuasion and persuasion belongs to doubt. SATS arrives when doubt has already thinned. At this stage, imaginal scenes no longer feel like wishes. They feel like familiar memories or quiet confirmations. There is no emotional urgency attached to them. You are not trying to feel something intensely. You are allowing yourself to drift in a state where the identity you have assumed feels natural enough to be taken for granted. This is why SATS near completion often feels brief and gentle. It does not need to be sustained. The impression takes quickly because the ground is already prepared. What is important to understand is that SATS here does not function as an action you perform, but as a state you enter, because effort has ended. You are not doing SATS to get something. You are experiencing SATS because your mind is no longer tense. The relaxed state arises naturally once checking has stopped and relief has settled in. In that relaxation, the new identity sinks below the level of conscious thought and becomes habitual. This is the final lock because habits form where attention rests without resistance. When the mind repeatedly returns to an identity without questioning it, that identity becomes the default. SATS accelerates this process not by force, but by removing interference. It allows the assumption to bypass conscious evaluation and settle into the deeper layers of being, where behavior, perception, and expectation originate. There is also a distinct emotional quality to SATS at this stage. It is not excitement or anticipation. It is quiet familiarity. You may notice that the desire no longer feels separate from you in these moments. It feels like something already lived in, something already known. The imaginal act does not feel like imagination anymore. It feels like a soft recollection, almost neutral in tone, yet deeply convincing. When SATS fulfills this role, there is nothing left to add afterward. You do not wake up feeling the need to reinforce the state. The day resumes, but from a slightly altered center. The identity remains intact without maintenance. This is how SATS completes the inner process. Not by producing visible results, but by sealing the assumption so thoroughly that results no longer need to be pursued. The lock clicks into place quietly, and once it does, the old self no longer has access. You didn't lose the desire, you became it. At the end of this inner journey, there is often a strange stillness that feels unfamiliar, even slightly disorienting, especially to those who have spent a long time consciously directing their attention. The desire that once felt vivid, emotionally charged, and mentally present now seems to have moved into the background of awareness. For many, this quieting is misread as loss or detachment, as though something important has slipped away. But what has actually occurred is not disappearance, but absorption. The desire has not vanished, it has been integrated. This is the essential truth that Neville Goddard emphasized repeatedly, though often subtly. Creation does not complete when the world changes. It completes when the inner state stabilizes. The outer world is not the signal, it is the echo. When the assumption has been fully accepted, the emotional charge that once accompanied it naturally dissolves. Desire requires distance to exist. Once that distance collapses, desire no longer presents itself as longing, it presents itself as being. What many call letting go was never an action taken by the will. It was a consequence of satisfaction. You did not release the desire through discipline or detachment. You stopped holding it because there was nothing left to hold. The sense of lack that once animated effort quietly resolved itself. In its place came a grounded neutrality that feels almost too ordinary to be meaningful. Yet this ordinariness is the clearest indicator that the inner work has concluded. This is why the quietness that follows can feel unsettling at first. The mind has been conditioned to associate progress with movement, emotion, and intensity. Silence can feel like stagnation when you are accustomed to effort, but in this context, silence is resolution. It is the sound of a question no longer being asked. The internal dialogue that once negotiated, corrected, and reaffirmed has ended, not because it was silenced, but because it became unnecessary. James Allen captured this principle when he observed that circumstances follow the state that is habitually lived in, not the state that is visited occasionally, and not the state that is emotionally charged, but the one that feels normal enough to go unnoticed. When the new identity no longer feels exciting or fragile, it has become habitual, and what is habitual quietly organizes life around itself without strain. Any fear that arises at this stage is simply the echo of the old self searching for relevance. It mistakes the absence of effort for disengagement, but effort was never the source of creation. Identity was, and identity, once stabilized, does not need protection. If effort has ended, if checking has faded, if relief has replaced urgency, then nothing has stalled. The work is complete. The old self has already collapsed, and the new life has already begun, long before anything on the outside needs to confirm it. Subscribe to this channel to remain aligned with the state where effort has ended, certainty is natural, and your life begins responding without strain.